Imagine being told you only have 12 months to live. That happened to Dr. Buteyko when he was only 29 years old in medical school. He then went on to cure diseases just by changing the way his patients breathed.
This shook up the entire medical industry and even led to several assassination attempts on Dr. Buteyko's life.
Before we get into it, let's take a deeper look at who was Dr. Buteyko.
Konstantin Pavlovich Buteyko was born in Ivanitsa, which is about 100 miles from Kiev in modern-day Ukraine, on January 27, 1923.
He grew up to become a Russian medical doctor and clinical physician. He received his medical degree from Moscow Medical Institute, where he studied from 1946 to 1952.
As a part of his medical training, Dr. Buteyko monitored the breathing patterns and rates of terminally ill patients prior to death.
After hundreds of hours spent observing and recording breathing patterns, he was able to predict with accuracy, often to the minute, the time of death of each patient.
He could tell how many days, hours, and even minutes were left in someone's life just based on their breathing.
One thing that he noted was that a patient's death was almost always preceded by an increased breathing rate, faster and erratic breaths.
While he was enrolled in university, he was diagnosed with malignant hypertension, a fatal form of blood pressure which gave him a life expectancy of just 12 months.
He consulted with the leading doctors at the time, and they told him that there was nothing he could do to reverse the disease. He was condemned to a life of sickness and early death.
Now keep in mind, he's only in his late 20s at this point. He spent years observing terminally ill patients, and suddenly he's become one of them.
But he continues on, researching mainly hypertension, which is like high blood pressure caused by stress. So that's where his direct experience lied. And in 1952, he finally graduated from the university with honors.
It was shortly after his graduation that he made a groundbreaking discovery, one that would not only change and save his own life, but the lives of countless others.
The story goes like this. It was October 7th, 1952. Buteyko's health was rapidly declining. He was experiencing constant headaches, pain in the lower back and chest, low energy, and shortness of breath.
He looked at himself in the mirror and he realized he was breathing in the same way as the terminally ill patients he had been observing. Deep, haggard breaths, his shoulders visibly moving up and down with each inhale and exhale, and his chest was slightly caved in. He straightened up his upper torso, gently pulled his shoulders back, and he took slow and even inhales through his nose, followed by gentle exhales, relaxing the diaphragm at the end of each breath. Within minutes, his pain completely disappeared.
It seemed too good to be true, so he consciously returned his breath to his old pattern, breathing deeply and quickly through the mouth, chest breathing, and his pain returned immediately, so he switched back to slow and relaxed nasal breathing, and the pain disappeared once more.
It's been said by some that this was one of the greatest, although largely unacknowledged, medical discoveries of the 20th century, that the breath is more deeply linked to health and disease than we realized.
Now, before we dive into his work, the results, and some of the more mysterious circumstances surrounding the research, it's important that we address a little of the science behind what's going on here.
Dr. Buteyko wasn't just acting on a whim when he changed his breathing patterns. Remember, he was a trained medical doctor, and he had spent most of his years of training studying terminal illness and the breath. He also had a firm understanding of his own illness and its causes.
Through his observations of dying patients, he knew that hyperventilation, that is, breathing quickly and deeply, an erratic breathing pattern, worsened the health of patients, while breathing more slowly caused them to eliminate their symptoms.
He also knew that the levels of CO2, carbon dioxide, in his own blood was far lower than normal, and it was common knowledge at the time among doctors that chronic hyperventilation, or overbreathing, lowers CO2.
Buteyko put these two pieces of the puzzle together, concluding that certain diseases may develop as a result of chronic overbreathing and could potentially be reversed by adopting a slower, more shallow breathing pattern.
Now, you may be thinking about all the times you've heard the advice, take a deep breath. Or maybe you've even practiced breathwork before, where you take deep and relatively fast breaths.
What we're talking about here is chronic overbreathing with poor form. Breathing through the mouth and into the chest, not engaging the diaphragm, and taking in more air than necessary day after day after day.
And get this, overbreathing is far more common today than it was just 100 years ago.
According to breath expert and researcher James Nestor, our average air consumption has increased from 5.25 liters of air per minute in the 1930s to over 9 liters per minute today.
Most of this has to do with the changing shape of our mouths, jaws, and faces. And if you really want to dive deep into that, we recommend reading Breath, The New Science of the Lost Art by the aforementioned James Nestor. And that's linked up directly in the description of this video.
So back to our story. Dr. Buteyko has this aha moment in the mirror. He changes his breath and it changes his life. Afterwards, he became so obsessed with the idea that overbreathing was causing these illnesses.
Today we understand that his theory of overbreathing has some scientific merit. We know that diseases like heart disease, ulcers, chronic inflammation, they're all linked to disturbances in circulation, blood pH, metabolism. How we breathe affects all of those functions.
But in the 1950s, this was completely unheard of. And Dr. Buteyko understood that he would need some serious evidence before he'd get any acceptance from his peers.
First, he started working on himself. He trained himself in proper breathing form and technique with a focus on more shallow and less erratic nasal breathing. This effectively cut down his overall liters of air per minute significantly.
Within a short period of time, he was completely healed. His blood pressure, CO2, and oxygen levels all returned to normal, and his persistent pain disappeared.
But one anecdotal case would hardly be enough to sway anyone, especially since the patient was himself.
So he started by working with one of the most common breathing conditions on the planet, asthma.
He was relatively unsurprised to find that most asthma patients were chronically overbreathing between their asthma attacks.
Over the course of a few years, working out of the Central and Lenin medical libraries, Dr. Buteyko devised a program to measure breathing, as well as a method of reconditioning patients' breathing patterns.
It mostly involved switching completely from mouth breathing to nasal breathing. There was also a focus on learning to relax the diaphragm after an exhale and keeping it relaxed until an air shortage was felt.
There was also a number of small lifestyle changes meant to assist the patient further in healing, including sleep protocols and proper hydration.
During this time, he started to draw a bit of attention to himself and his work. Fellow doctors and clinicians would scoff at his work, and already the mainstream medical world began to write him off as a pseudoscientist.
But Buteyko didn't care, and from 1958 to 1959, he conducted clinical trials of using his breath training approach on a mixed group of 200 people, some sick and some healthy.
On January 11, 1960, he demonstrated to the scientific forum at the Institute the clear correlation between depth of breathing, carbon dioxide levels in the body, and the state of health.
His research was largely rejected. One colleague even accused him of playing dirty tricks and called his experiments fraudulent.
The problem was that Buteyko's research directly challenged many of the theories upon which medicine was based. At that time, and still largely today, conventional medicine only looks to surgery and extensive medication as the path to curing disease.
It was inconceivable to the medical community that something as simple as a change in breathing patterns could have such a dramatic effect on health and disease.
But despite all of that, one thing went right for Dr. Buteyko on that frigid January day in 1960. He gained the temporary support of Professor Mishalkin, the chairman of the scientific forum, and that enabled him to continue his research.
He was named the director of a respiratory laboratory in Novosibirsk, outfitted with the most up-to-date technology of the time. He was also assigned a team of 200 medical professionals under his supervision.
Over the next few years, he gradually developed a series of protocols that he called the Buteyko Volitional Breathing Program. And by 1967, over 1,000 patients suffering from asthma, hypertension, and other illnesses had completely recovered using Buteyko's methods.
So this is where things start to get really interesting. After successfully curing over 1,000 patients, Buteyko goes back to Professor
Mishalkin,
the only man who had supported him back in 1960, to present his findings.
Mishalkin outright refuses to allow an official scientific trial of the Buteyko method. But Buteyko was insistent, approaching him repeatedly with the data, urging him to reconsider, to no avail.
Shortly after, All of Buteyko's laboratory equipment was confiscated and the lab was closed. He was officially reprimanded and warned not to make any public appearances or speeches on his research or any topic associated with breathing and health.
According to one account by a Russian journalist named Sergei Altukov, Buteyko fully expected to be killed because of his discovery. He reportedly told his staff before the lab closed that he would be dead within 2 months, and they should take care to preserve their own lives as well as the discovery that they had made together.
So around this time, he suffered multiple bouts of severe food poisoning, one of which almost took his life. And then there was an extremely suspicious car accident in which the vehicle transporting Dr. Buteyko was rammed and forced off the road by another car. The whole thing reeked of a mafia-style assassination attempt.
But the good doctor survived through it all, and in 1968, he finally got a break. Somehow, word of his successful treatments for asthma and hypertension patients had reached the press.
The coverage began locally and quickly spread around the world, garnering massive public support. Word of Buteyko's method reached the Minister of Health, who paid a visit to the small private clinic that the doctor was currently operating out of.
Minister Petrovsky looked over the data and told Dr. Buteyko that he would immediately endorse his program and implement it into standard medical practice throughout all of Russia if he could successfully treat 80% of the patients given to him in a trial run of his method.
He allocated a 50-bed facility for the trials, including all of the necessary equipment and staff. However, there was one condition. All the patients used for the trial had to be the most serious and difficult cases, the ones not otherwise treatable by conventional methods of medicine.
Of those 46 patients that underwent Buteyko's treatment, 95% were officially recognized as cured.
According to the official documents, some of these patients had over 20 different medical conditions. One female patient in particular had been recommended to undergo a mastectomy after being diagnosed with an early-stage malignant tumor.
She was included in these trials because she also had asthma. Not only did she recover from her asthma, but after her treatment with Dr. Buteyko, her malignant tumor was no longer showing up on scans.
The entire trial was monitored by the Russian Health Ministry, and the astonishing results were sent over to Minister Petrovsky for review.
But the ministry declared the trial a failure. They stated that only 2 of the 46 patients had recovered. Dr. Buteyko's lab was once again shut down, his equipment was confiscated, and his staff was fired.
Now, not much is known what happened to Dr. Buteyko over the next 12 years, but one thing is certain, he never stopped teaching his method. Unofficial breathing clinics started popping up all over Russia, in almost every major city except the capital.
It appeared that despite the threats, the falsified test results, the lab closures, and the confiscated equipment, the doctor himself, along with the originally trained team of practitioners, continued to treat patients with great success.
Word finally reached the Russian government, who decided to conduct a second official review of the original data submitted in the 46-person trial.
The second official review was conducted at the First Moscow Institute of Pediatric Diseases in April 1980 at the direction of the Government Committee for Science and Technology of the Soviet Ministry of the USSR.
The study reversed the findings of the first trial conducted in Leningrad. Buteyko's method was a success.
Not only that, but they found that the 2 patients from the original study who did not initially recover had been cured of their diseases after longer treatment. Buteyko's method had achieved a 100% success rate.
The Soviet Health Ministry officially acknowledged Buteyko's discovery in 1983, more than 20 years after it first had been made.
It's since been reported that Buteyko's method has been successfully taught to more than 1 million citizens of Russia and the surrounding countries.
Dr. Buteyko went on to write over 50 scientific publications detailing the relationship between respiration, carbon dioxide, and disease.
The basis of the Buteyko breathing method, detailing the relationship between carbon dioxide and breath holding, is now taught around the world at major universities.
In 1990, the Buteyko method was brought abroad for the first time by a man named Kyle Alberts, who suffered a heart condition called an angina attack while visiting Russia. His illness was completely cured, much to his surprise, using Buteyko's techniques.
He was obviously so pleased with the results that he sponsored 2 Russian Buteyko teachers to travel with him back to Australia, where they began teaching.
The teachings quickly spread first to New Zealand and then to the UK. There are now Buteyko clinics all over the world, and successful clinical trials have been demonstrated in England, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Ukraine.
Dr. Buteyko made at least one trip to New Zealand and Australia late in his life to help support the Western teachers, and he passed away in 2003.
The success of Buteyko's method challenges many long-held beliefs within the medical community. It's not really all that surprising that most people haven't heard of it, especially in countries where the treatment of medical illness is a multi-billion-dollar business.
It's impossible for us to say for certain whether our everyday breathing patterns are directly causing disease and illness.
What we can say for certain is that the way we breathe directly affects the way we feel, and that alone is a connection worth exploring. Thanks so much for listening to us. If you enjoyed this, the way you can support us is by subscribing to our channel and giving us a like, and we'd love to hear your comment as well. My name is Jake.
My name's Danny.
And we're here to help you breathe and think better.
Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.